Hey everybody, welcome to the lesson. In this lesson, you're going to learn web development fundamentals, and you're going to be building a Spanish practice tool that we're calling Spanish Pronoun Picker. The goals for this lesson are pretty straightforward. We want you to gain experience and exposure with modern web tools. Specifically, we're going to expose you to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In the end, you're going to remix a web page that I've already created. If you look to the right on the screen, you'll see that there's a web page, and at the top it says pick the pronoun. And then after that, it has a conjugated Spanish verb and 5 buttons which represent the pronouns that the verb could match. So this is what you're going to be building, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that later. At the end of the day, you're going to build something that will allow you to drill and kill and refine your Spanish skills. So what are we building? We're going to be building a mobile-friendly web page, which means it'll even work on your tiny phone screen. What this web page does is it randomly generates a conjugated Spanish verb and then gives the user an opportunity to match that verb with the right pronoun. If they get it right, they get 100 points. If they get it wrong, they lose 100 points. So let's take a closer look at what we're going to be building. Okay. So this is what our final product looks like. It's a very simple web page. At the top it says pick the pronoun, and then you'll see that there is a randomly chosen conjugated Spanish verb and 5 buttons underneath of possible pronouns that match it. If I'm super smart and I'm able to match it, I get 100 points. If I've somehow forgotten what the matching pronoun is and I choose the wrong option, I will not only lose points, but it will hide the button until I finally get it right, and then I'll be presented with a new conjugated verb. So very straightforward web page, but there's a lot you're going to need to know in order to create this. So let's get on with that right away. When it comes to web development, there's 3 really important technologies to know. The first is HTML. HTML is used to author your web pages. It defines the structure and contents of the pages that you want people to interact with. Web pages are made up of HTML elements. And by elements, I mean paragraphs, images, links, videos. In order to put one of these elements on a page, however, you need to define them using what are called tags. Just as an aside, Tim Berners-Lee not only invented the World Wide Web and the whole system that allows us to share information, but he also invented HTML. HTML is like all languages. It evolves rapidly and it changes. So let's take a look at the anatomy of an element. Let's say I'm building a web page and I want to put a button on it. And let's say that button should have a label that says click me. This right here is the HTML that you would use. This is what we call a button element. Right here, this is the opening tag. On the end, there's a closing tag. In the middle, we define the text that we want the user to see on our button. And then you'll probably notice that in the opening tag, there's this extra stuff. In the opening tag of elements, you are allowed to define all types of attributes and values. This allows you to refine what the button should look like, what it should do, how it should be styled. It's important to note, however, that some elements that you put on your pages are what are called void elements. They don't require opening and closing tags. They normally just require an opening tag. A perfect example of this is the line break element, otherwise known as BR. When you want to put a line break element into one of your HTML pages, you simply list BR. Not an opening and closing tag like you see in this example. When it comes to web pages, one of the most important things to understand is that every web page has a structure. It's what we call a boilerplate. It kind of has its own skeleton, if you will. It can get complicated, but the simplest way to think about it is that a web page is like you. It has one head and one body in that order. If we were to take a look at the simplest web page known to mankind, represented here, you would see that there's an opening and closing HTML tag right here and right here. Inside of that, there's one head and one body in that order. Notice how both head and body have opening and closing tags. Anything you want to put in the head goes inside those tags. Anything you want to go inside the body goes inside those body tags. The head contains the information about the page. It's what we call metadata, which is a fancy word for data about data. Now, the body of an HTML page contains the content, what we want the user to see. In this case, our content is just one paragraph. The next technology we need to talk about is called CSS, which is short for Cascading Style Sheet. CSS is the language, it's the web technology that we use to style, to present our web pages in a particular way. HTML is the structure and the content. CSS is the presentation. So the way that we style web pages is by using something called CSS rules, also known as rule sets. What they allow us to do is to target HTML elements on our pages and then style them by setting certain properties. You probably heard the word style sheet before. Well, just like any big problem, web development is no different. We break up a large problem into smaller pieces. Style sheets are separate files that we use to only put CSS in. So let's talk about the big idea behind CSS. The big idea behind CSS is that you want to separate the structure of your page from how it's presented. So just like in this picture here, on the left, you will see that the HTML is the structural layer. Okay, there's nothing fancy about it. Once we add CSS, the presentation layer, it looks a lot better. So speaking of looking a lot better, use this as an analogy. On the left, the Hollywood actress, just like she wakes up every day, that's your HTML. The minute you add CSS, the hair, the makeup, and the wardrobe, if you will, you get the final product. So let's go back. Earlier, we created an HTML button. It was gray and it said, "Click me." Now I've changed it a little bit. Now it has some style. Its background color is black and the text color has been changed to white. How would I do this using CSS? This is the exact CSS that I would use to do this. Let's break this down a little bit. In the very beginning, you'll see something called the selector. What this does is selects the element or elements on the page that I want to style. And then after that, you will see that inside a set of curly braces, there are these pairs of properties and values. Here, I'm changing the color property, which represents what color the text is, and the value I'm giving it is white. If you put this whole thing together, you have what's called a CSS rule. Your CSS rules go into your style sheets, and there can be many of them. CSS rules are simply this combination of selectors, like you see here, where I'm selecting my button, and declaration blocks. And by declaration block, I mean anything that's within these curly braces that defines all of the properties and values to set. This is what a CSS rule looks like. And last but not least, I want to expose you to JavaScript. JavaScript is the programming language of the browser. What it allows you to do is to make your pages come to life, to program them so that they can respond to users and do a variety of things. Without JavaScript, a web page would just sit there and it wouldn't be of much use at all. It is important to note, however, that JavaScript is totally different from another programming language you may or may not have heard of called Java. JavaScript is lightweight, it's very informal, and it's pretty easy to learn. So I'm going to walk you through an example. This right here is an example of JavaScript. In this case, it's a function, something that does something. The name of our function is say hi. And the only thing that our say hi function does is it alerts the user with a message, hi. And by alert, I mean a pop-up that will say hi. So how could I write some pretty simple JavaScript and demonstrate that JavaScript can make the page do things? Let's go back to our button. So notice how highlighted in yellow where it says on click, say hi. What I've done is in the opening tag of my button element, I've added an attribute called on click, and I've set its value to say hi. What this means is that when someone clicks on the button, when they click on click me, it's going to run or execute, if you will, this JavaScript code. So once again, let's say I wanted something to happen when the user clicked on a button. I could do something like this. In this particular case, they would click on the button, this JavaScript would execute, and then they would see a pop-up, an alert that says hi. That's the basic idea behind JavaScript. Let's talk about the basic idea behind this project. Let's bring it all together. So when we're creating something for the web, we break it down into these areas of concern: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This allows us to create a big problem and break it down into small, manageable pieces that make sense. In the project that you're going to be remixing, you will see that it has 3 files. One is called index.html, which contains the structure and content of your web page. There's going to be one called style.css, which only has your CSS rules. And then there's going to be a file called pronoun-picker, and that's going to contain all the code for your page. So we're going to be utilizing all 3 of the technologies we talked about. And here lists the files and what each file is meant to do in terms of our solution. The index page will define our HTML code, our page's structure. Our style will be totally separate, and then we'll have one file that is nothing but the code that is responsible for choosing the random verb, handling when a user clicks on a button, storing the score, and things like that. Mozilla Thimble is an awesome tool, and that's what we're going to be using during this project. It's an online code editor. It allows you to write for the web on the web, which is pretty awesome. This is a great way to learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Look at the picture that you see very closely. On the left, you'll see there's a section called Files, and we have the 3 files that I talked about earlier. Depending upon which file you've clicked on, you can edit it in this larger editor part of the page. And on the right, what makes Thimble really cool is you can see the page as you're building it. You can see your changes live, and that's a great way to learn. All right, we're almost there. There's only one thing left to do. The last thing I'd like to do is to walk you through the final code. The reason why this is important is that first and foremost, you need to gain exposure. When you were first learning a foreign language, everything seemed foreign, but over time, more and more of it made sense. When I walk you through the code, you shouldn't necessarily understand everything, but a lot of what you see should make logical sense. So please remember that we are just going to have you make tiny changes. This is how you ultimately learn anything in computer science. You start changing something and proving to yourself that you understand it and that you can control what's in front of you. You are not expected to understand everything that you see whatsoever. That is not a fair, reasonable expectation. But as I walk you through the code, hopefully it will reinforce not only what you've learned, but also that you know more than you think you do. Okay, so now I'm in Mozilla Thimble, and here is my code. In the left section that says Files, you can see that I have my 3 files: index.html, pronoun-picker.js, and style.css. We're going to start by looking at the contents of the index.html, which should have all of our HTML in it. Remember how we talked about how every HTML page has one head and one body in that order? So our page starts off with this HTML opening tag. It ends with this closing tag. This is what's called the root element. Inside the root element, as we discussed, we have one head, one body in that order. Inside the head, we have metadata, such as the title that we want to give our web page. This right here is a link to a Google Web font, which allows us to have this neat looking font. Then we have a link right here, which brings in our style sheet. I want to give you guys an idea of just what this page would look like if we didn't have style. If you were to take away the style, you would have something that ugly. So it gives you an idea of the role that CSS plays. Similarly, let's say that I didn't have any JavaScript, which is this line right here. How bad would that be? As you can see, no matter what I do, the page just sits there. It doesn't do anything whatsoever. So that should give you some idea of the importance of both the CSS and JavaScript, and we're going to be looking at those in a minute. Inside the body, we have everything that we want the user to see. We've got this heading right here. It says pick the pronoun. Right here, this is a little placeholder. It's a paragraph where we put our random verb. And then you're going to see 5 buttons. Each button has a label with the pronoun, and then right afterwards it has a line break. At the very bottom of the page, we have another element which stores our score, and then a paragraph which tells the user what they get for correct and incorrect answers respectively. So that's your HTML, the structure of the page. One of the things you'll notice is that the page in the head defines where's my style and where's my code. So let's take a look at the style. My style sheet contains 6 CSS rules. And as we discussed earlier, a CSS rule is the combination of a selector. For example, on line 12, I have a selector which says button. What that means is I want to style all of the buttons on my page. And then right after that, I have what's called the declaration block, which is a series of property value pairs. So what I'm saying here is I want to style all 5 of my buttons. I want to give them this font. I want them to be 280 pixels wide. I want the font to be pretty large at 30 pixels, and I want my buttons to have rounded edges. To get started with CSS, you start small. For example, let's say the verb, where up here it says tango, is purple right now. What if I wanted it to be red? Changing CSS is that simple. All I would have to do is change the value. And as you can see, with Thimble, I get to see my changes dynamically, which is pretty awesome. Put that back. Let's move on to the pronounpicker.js file. This is all of our code. All right. Here at the very top, you'll see it says var, and then it says verb, pronoun, score. What this is doing is it's declaring something called variables. Variables are the places inside a program where we store information that we want to use later. For example, you'll see one with the name score. Throughout the life of the game, we want to be able to track the user's score. As we move down the code, you'll see where there's another variable called verbs. This is a list, an array. It's a collection of these verb pronoun combinations. These are all of the things that we can randomly choose from to show the user. The last 2 things you'll see in this file are functions. There's a function called pickVerb, and there's a function called checkResponse. PickVerb does exactly what it sounds like. It randomly chooses from this verbs array what conjugated verb we're going to put here. It stores which one it picked in a variable so that we can check later on to see whether the user made the right choice. And lastly, it will actually write to the page the verb that was picked. The checkResponse function does exactly what it sounds like it's doing. It checks the user's response. It responds to the button click. The first thing it does is it grabs the pronoun that the user picked, and it tries to see whether they chose the correct one. If they chose the correct one, we add 100 to the score, we update the score on the screen, and we choose a new verb randomly to show the user. We also do some work here in setting all of the buttons back to visible. If for some reason the user picks the wrong option, we hide the button we subtract 100 from the score, and of course, anytime we change the score, we have to update the page to reflect the new score. So that is the JavaScript. With all of that said, you should have enough context and background to begin the project. Good luck. Let me know what kind of questions you have, and have a great day.